Greetings, my name is Hee-Eun Kim, President and CEO of the Center for Asia-Pacific Strategy. Our Asia-Pacific Maritime Security Roundtable series started in July 2021 and is concluding with this final panel discussion. The topic of the first roundtable was rules-based order in action. The second topic was China and the littoral states. The third roundtable discussion was China's Belt and Road Initiative. And in this final roundtable, the discussion will be about enhancing maritime security in the Asia-Pacific region. We hope this series of discussion helped to mitigate the blind side of this most complex security challenge to global presence and the future. Now I'd like to introduce General Gerber, who will be moderating today's discussion. He's the president of the Foundation Council of the Swiss Armed Forces Historic Material Foundation. He's also the co-chair of the annual Senior Officer Seminar on Leadership and Crisis Management at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Furthermore, he is representing the Swiss Armed Forces on the International Military Council on Climate and Security. He's also served as the Swiss member and head of the Swiss delegation to the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, Panmunjom, Republic of Korea. And last but not least, he is the chairman of the board of directors of our Center for Asia-Pacific Strategy. And now over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Kim, for this very kind introduction. In the previous roundtables on this general topic, as Ms. Kim was alluding to, we were covering maritime and other security challenges, mainly from United States, Korean, and Australian perspectives. This edition wants to open up the spectrum into Europe with France and Germany, as well as into a very important actor in the region, particularly in economic terms, Singapore. Whereas France is a player within the region with her territoire outre-mer, with a permanent military command based at Papeete in French Polynesia, Germany's maritime and naval presence seems to be temporary so far, but with increasing messages of an interest in this part of the globe. The recent extended tour of the frigate Bayern in Indo-Pacific waters has been a clear indication to that. The rise and ever more assertiveness of China, not only in Asia-Pacific, but beyond, has increased the challenges, particularly also in maritime security. The United States, since the Obama administration with its pivot to Asia-Pacific, is working on at least hedging China's drive for hegemony and thus maintaining its influence and a rule-based balance. Interestingly enough, it is the only area in US foreign policy that maintained a pretty high level of continuity through several administrations. With the extended global pandemic, and particularly from a European perspective with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, even more challenges to global and regional security, as well as trade, added to the complex situation in Asia-Pacific. In this part of the world, maritime security is absolutely key. How to address these challenges, critical maritime routes, sea lines of communications, and other issues against this background? To do so, I'm very delighted to be joined by three eminent experts and practitioners with a French, German, and Singaporean perspective. With that, I would like to go over and to introduce our three speakers. First, I welcome from Paris, France, Dr. Frédéric Grard, who is a senior policy fellow at the Foreign Council on Foreign Relations and a non-resident senior fellow of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International, as well as the National Security Center of Sri Lanka. He was previously project manager responsible for the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific at the Center for Analysis, Forecasting and Strategy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Prior to joining Carnegie, Dr. Grard was in charge of Asia relations within the Directorate for Strategic Affairs of the French Ministry of Defense. He also worked at the French Embassy in Pakistan and from 1999 to 2003 was director of the Center for Human Sciences in New Delhi. Dr. Grard has written extensively on Asian security issues, particularly in South Asia. His latest book, published in January 2022 and co-authored with Jean-Louis Samon, is entitled The Indian Ocean as a New Political and Security Region. Very warm welcome to Dr. Grard. From Germany, I'm very happy and glad to welcome a long-standing friend, Vice Admiral Lutz Feld. Since retiring from an illustrious military career in April 2006, including serving as the Chief of Naval Staff for the German Navy, Vice Admiral Lutz Feld has taken over several posts of honor dealing with maritime topics. He has been contracted by the European Commission and the European Defence Agency for review of the EU-led Operation Atalanta, a counter-piracy military operation at the sea off the Horn of Africa and in the Western Indian Ocean. Since 2010, he is one of 5 directors of Wise Pens International, dealing with all aspects of maritime security, with one focus on information sharing, harbor security, and interagency cooperation. The other focus is still on the development of the Arctic Ocean and its surrounding seas, and the role of Russia and China in this context. He has worked on maritime security issues related to South Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, especially during the Critical Maritime Routes Project. A very warm welcome to Admiral Feld. And last but not least, I warmly welcome from Singapore, Dr. Colin Cole, who is a research fellow at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, which is a constituent unit of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, based in Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He has research interests on naval affairs in the Indo-Pacific, focusing on Southeast Asia. Dr. Cole has published several op-eds, policy and academic journal articles, as well as chapters for edited volumes covering his research areas. He has also taught at Singapore Armed Forces Professional Military Education and Training courses. Besides research and teaching, Dr. Cole also contributes his perspectives to various local and international media outlets and participates in activities with geopolitical risks and consultancies. So far for the introduction, I suggest that we follow the following procedures, that I would invite our esteemed panelists in the order of my introduction, that they would start off with their initial remarks and comments, and that then I would take over with questions, and at the end that we would have a discussion around the table. I was asking the panelists to speak in their initial statement for about 10 minutes. With that, I would like to hand over the floor to Dr. Grard. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Gerald, and thank you very much to the organizer for having me today. I'm not sure I'm going to do justice to the topic in 10 minutes, but I'm going to try my best to give you a French perspective, but I certainly don't pretend to present the French perspective on anything in any case. When I read the topic, I was a little surprised. Asia-Pacific is a somewhat outdated term in many ways. I can understand why people use it, but this is definitely not the way the French would frame it. And there is a reason for that. First of all, the Indo-Pacific, like the Asia-Pacific concept, are strategic concept. I mean, so they are meant to embrace the interests of whoever define them. And this is the same thing for France. And therefore, we have a need to define the Indo-Pacific on our own terms. Not because this is the nice thing to talk about right now, not because this is a flavor of the day, but this because for us there is a reality of it. There is a reality because we've got territories and population in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific, and therefore we need to ensure a continuity in the security of those two. And which, by the way, means that France's interest for the concept and the region that it has defined subsequently is not something which is temporary and so on. This is there to last because there is a duty of the states for its population to start with and its interest over there. So how do we find it? Do we define it, and how do we define the threat within it? I could give you the official line, which defines in quite general terms that this is a mix, of course, of traditional threat mixed with non-traditional one. On the one side, we've got great power rivalry, and increasingly so the risk of power projection. We do have nuclear proliferation and so on and so forth. On the non-traditional side, we've got all traffics of all kind, human, drugs, we've got IU fishing, we've got all of that. But what I would like to say is the lines between those two are increasingly being blurred here today. Why? Because many of what we used to really describe as traditional are being used by powers in order to pursue their geopolitical interests. I'm referring obviously to China. Of course, no French document will say so in those terms. Also, French President Emmanuel Macron said a few very clear things about China in various instances, starting with various official documents that he signed when he took over as president in 2017, to the Garden Island speech and so on and so forth. So there we go. And what is meant is, as Jérôme said about the previous session, the willingness to not counter China, but at least make sure that its aspiration to hegemony doesn't really materialize. This does not imply a priori hostility, but this does imply a few things that are being taken care of in the strategy. That explains also why, if you look at the various French texts, I mean, the perspective is usually much larger than simply the military dimension of it. The military is very much there. I mean, not that the French pretend to be a big military power in the Indo-Pacific, but it does have assets in La Réunion, it does have assets in New Caledonia, it does have assets in French Polynesia and so on, and does operate from this place. There is always a forward deployment of French forces of this. But this is not limited to that. And even those forces have a role to play in other dimensions of the Indo-Pacific. If the threat is characterized by its hybrid nature, if every activity is weaponized to serve geopolitical purpose, then it does make sense to give those same activities a very clearly defined contours so we can monitor them and make sure they are not used against our interests. This is very much the case, for example, for IU fishing. I mean, this has been the case for decades now in the South China Sea. This is increasingly the case in the Indian Ocean. Ask the read the Crimaio report. And for those who don't know, Crimaio is a wide fishing system which allows a group of islands in the Southwest Indian Ocean to control, to monitor at least the area. Ask them, and what you see is that every single country from Iran to South Africa are complaining, for example, about Chinese IU fishing practices. Now, why do I say from Iran to South Africa? Because, as you can see, it means that there are countries which are politically well connected with China, which have problem with this. But it means also that there are ways to perhaps try to counter it. So this is the way we look at it. Climate is the same thing. Climate has impact on many other dimensions. It has potentially impact on the very existence of a number of island states in the Indo-Pacific. It has impact critical infrastructure and so on. But it does also impact the relationship between those states or those places and China. And it does so through the dependency that it does create. I mean, we all have in mind Batota and so on, and Batota is not the sole responsibility of the Chinese. There is definitely a local one, but it does explain how the link works. Because you're too dependent financially, then you ask for compensation, and those compensation have nothing to do with the initial, or eventually nothing to do with the initial purpose of what you did build, but could be used for something else. And this is the kind of thing that France has been trying to counter. So how it did so? When it comes to the non-traditional threat that I was describing, a lot of the assets that we have in the in La Réunion, in Papeete, in Nouméa, are being used to, of course, monitor the area. That's one aspect. But there have also been a number of partnerships being created. There was a partnership, a long-time one, with India, for example, and in the maritime domain, I mean, the two countries have been exercising together since 1993 with the creation of the Varuna exercise. There has been a strong partnership, a very strong one with Australia at some point until AUKUS came in. There has been a partnership since 2015 with Japan. There is, and there has been an attempt to articulate those three, but all of this was also articulated with the, or if not articulated, at least made compatible with the alliance of France with the United States. I mean, in the last dimension of it, and this is not the list of one, this is the one that we are currently developing in Europe, and which has been made possible by the cooperation with Germany and the Netherlands, was the creation of an EU-India strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. This too is a pillar of this cooperation. It has a maritime dimension per se, which again includes maritime security elements per se, but also ocean governance elements which help structure the space in which we're talking about, but also acknowledge implicitly the fact that the nature of the threat that we meet right now is much more diverse than simply military, and articulate all those various dimensions in one given strategy. We don't need, for example, EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific simply to have a trade policy. We don't need that for climate policy. We can have an independent climate policy. We can have an independent security policy as well. The fact that all this is articulated in one strategy means very clearly that all this makes sense in connection with one another. This is what constitutes a strategy, which is also the weakness of it. Because on the one side, this answers the problem comprehensively. On the other one, it does offer the possibility for state to pick and choose, and therefore weakens the entire edifice at the same time. So there is a balance which is perhaps not found yet, which is in the making, but which is being searched for right now. So this is where we stand. So we had all this, the articulation of our own relation with the United States, with the articulated with the set of relationship that we have in the region itself. Trying to bring in, again, with the cooperation of Germany and the Netherlands, Europe, because Europe have interest in it, was the pillars of the French strategy in the Indo-Pacific and has been developed as such. Now, you can understand just by saying so why, for example, the AUKUS episode was so painful for France. It had been kept outside something which he was deeply concerned about. Second, it did de facto weaken a pillar of the strategy, the one with Australia. And similarly, it did weaken at some point the confidence in the United States, because the question that everybody had was not, do we still have common interests with Australia? Do we still have common interests with the UK? Do we still have common interests with the US? We do. Everybody knew that in France. The question was, can we actually work, and is the trust there so that we can work together in a reasonable manner? I mean, state relations are what they are. They are state relations. But nevertheless, unless you've got a minimum trust, things can't really work out. That's what the problem is. And I hope we're getting over that right now. The Shangri-La dialogue last week was certainly evidence that something is moving in the right direction. To what extent will France and Australia resume relation to a level comparable to what it was earlier, that I don't know, and the future will tell, only the future. But I mean, the things are going in that direction at the moment, and this is something which is probably welcome. So I'll stop there right now. I don't know if I did spend the whole time, but that's okay. We'll come back to a few questions later on. No?
Thank you, Dr. Gerber, for this very comprehensive aperçu on the situation. And I'm very pleased to hear that you really opened up the focus of the military dimension into a comprehensive dimension, because I think maritime security, wherever it is, whether in the Asia-Pacific or in other areas, is not only a military issue, and it's not only a military strategy issue, but it goes well beyond that. So that was a very good start for our discussion then after. Thank you. And then I would like to hand over to Admiral Felt, and would like to give him the floor. And I'm very curious on whether he will tell us something on his projects on maritime routes. I'm pretty sure that he will mention that as well. So the floor is yours, Admiral. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the Center of Asia-Pacific Strategy, giving me the opportunity to talk about this issue. I would like to start in a different way, if I may. There is one quite different in thinking and in acting between the West and, if I may say so, the Indian Pacific region, or yes, part of the world. And this is that we in our countries, especially in Germany, but in Europe as a whole, we are suffering what we are calling sea blindness. And this term, you can explain it in a different way. I always appreciate the sentences my British colleague has found it. Sea blindness is the failure to appreciate the essential maritime component in most human activities. And I think this gives you the feeling what we have to do. So in Europe and in Germany especially, we are really suffering under sea blindness. And talking about the Navy as a military part of it is only, it's a very small part of it. And I totally agree with Dr. Gerber that of course we have to look in maritime security issues. It's a comprehensive issue. In English, we have the three words for safety. This is safety does mean in relation to a ship, it's internal safety. Security is a little bit of safety as well, but it's going to the other side, to defense, which is on the right side as well. But maritime security is in between. Sometimes it's more to defense, sometimes it's more to safety. But it is, of course, dealing with all aspects of the maritime domain. And this, your questions are very clear about that. It's about maritime security, it's about economy, it's about habitat, which is very important, and including climate change. And I think climate change will be one of the driving factors in maritime security issues as well. And then we have the power projection issue, which is dominating sometimes the situation and the discussion in a way which is not really appropriate if you look into the whole issue. And the fourth is, of course, a very important one, and these are the resources. And if you look into the Pacific, Indo-Pacific area, in both oceans, including then adding to that the Arctic Ocean as well, then of course it is very obvious that resources exploitation is one of the very it's for some nations, for China, example, for Russia, it is the most important one. And for other nations, it's different. Canada, as well as US and other, and the European Union, for example, are dealing with the climate change as a very important priority #1 issue as well. But it is in the Indo-Pacific, it is very important to look into the different parts which we can find in these maritime key dimensions. And this is the highway, the issue of transport of resources, but transport of goods from the Asian to Europe to the US. Then as resources which are especially important in the area where China is claiming its interests in the South China Sea. It's not only about defense, it's about resources as well. And then we have the habitat issue, which is very important. And from my point of view, but this is my personal view, is that habitat will become more and more important, and a nation which is ignoring the importance of habitat, which is covering that, and illegal fishing is one part of this as well, as climate change is a very important part. And then we are coming to the power projection. And due to the war in Ukraine, everybody is now talking about power projection. And this is limiting, I think this is limiting the issue of maritime security to the military, which is not appropriate. And I think we have to discuss this, of course. And I know that if you look to the future, then of course the Asian region has already created a lot of very important relationships and organizations where they can exchange information, where they are sitting together discussing it, and it's based on trust and confidence. And even if you think that these both terms are, if I may say, very, very politically correct, they are still valid. And if, for example, a country like Singapore, which is a very important pillar in the whole region, is dealing with both with the commerce, one of the biggest harbors of the world is Singapore, and then having a good defense issue as well, and a maritime issue as well, maritime security issue as well, then of course it has a central role in Asia, and therefore I think it's, if I may say so, it's a very good idea to listen to Dr. Key as well. So I think maritime security has a little to do with maritime defense and a little to do with maritime safety. But in this, we are talking about a lot of measures, a lot of capabilities, which are governmental capabilities, like a Coast Guard, like fishery protection, like acts against criminal illegal fishing and all these kind of things, but they are not purely military. They are part of other responsibilities of our governments. And I think in Europe, we are clearly aware of the separation between that, and only very few countries, like France, as an example, has made a very good decision to put both together and to say one part of the French Navy is responsible for Coast Guard issues as well, and other parts are for defense. And this makes it much more easier to interconnect and to act together and to exchange information. And monitoring the situation in the Indo-Pacific Ocean is one of the most critical issues. And therefore, I think monitoring, for example, the Strait of Malacca, and with the organizations which are in place there, is something which has increased maritime security. And this is something which I would want to say as my last sentence is, there is already an existing maritime security system between a lot of states, and the wish, the political wish, and the military capability for implementation is there. And in some areas, I think the Indo-Pacific situation is a little bit ahead of the European situation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Admiral Felt. I'm very grateful for your comments. It is very interesting to hear from a very senior naval officer that he really focuses on this issue, and I found it very interesting that we should not only look for power projection and military aspects of the whole region. So in that sense, you echoed Dr. Grar, who was also in this, went in that direction. And this reminds me of the previous roundtables we had or other events on this part of the world, where you had much more a focus on military domain, on military aspects of hedging and countering, on you name it. And now the two speakers today, they mention it as an important part, but go beyond that, that there are other aspects which are at least as important as the pure military domain. So thank you very much. We'll come back to some of these aspects in a minute. But before doing so, I would like to hand over, last but not least, and Singapore has already been mentioned as an important pillar and player in the region. Dr. Ko, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And very good morning to all of you, or good afternoon. It is an evening on my side. Now, many thanks to the Center for Asia-Pacific Security for inviting me to share my views. And I have to say that I do represent the Singapore government, speaking solely in my capacity as a think tanker in RSIS. And of course, I don't fully represent Southeast Asia as well. And this is something that is a point of contention sometimes, because very often when we invite one Southeast Asian participant, we may expect him or her to try to share as much as possible when it comes to the regional perspectives. So what I'm trying to do here is to try to cover the Singaporean perspectives of maritime security in the region, but at the same time, where possible, I will try to put in my perspectives when it comes to Southeast Asia and what I think, what they were thinking about as well. Now, on these maritime security issues, allow me to give a broad overview of what we are expecting, what we see as potential security challenges, and what are the mitigation measures that were undertaken so far. And after that, we'll have time for a further discussion on the points that I raised. Now, I think it's important to note that when we talk about Asia Pacific, and of course, I agree with Dr. Gray on the new concept, because even in Southeast Asia, for example, there has been already the Indo-Pacific entering its lingo. It is best represented by the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific that was being published in June 2019. And that was in response to the competing Indo-Pacific concepts, visions, or strategies that were floated around by the various regional powers, including, for example, Australia, India, Japan, US, and France, Germany, and even Netherlands, and the EU. And so therefore, Southeast Asia, having found itself in a very peculiar situation, is somewhat compelled to have its own regional perspectives on the Indo-Pacific. But of course, that goes back to the earlier point that I raised, that in the Indo-Pacific, it is a very diverse region. I tend to see it more from a sub-regional perspective. For example, we can divide the Indo-Pacific into different complexes. First is, for example, the Northeast Asia. So that will include those countries like China, Japan, Korea, and even the Russian Far East. And then you go down to Southeast Asia, that is largely revolving around the 10 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And then you go further west, you're talking about the countries in South Asia, including India and the smaller South Asian littoral states. And last but not least, the Oceania that you're talking about, Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific island countries. And it is in the recent times that much of the emphasis has started to shift towards the South Pacific, especially after China and the Solomon Islands signed a rather unprecedented security agreement that started to make everybody pay attention to that particular region that has long been neglected, vis-a-vis Southeast Asia, or for the main part, much of the Western Pacific. Now, because there were sub-regional differences, I would not want to go into depth, all these various sub-regional differences and how maritime security is being perceived. but allow me to just generally observe that there are different threat perceptions and there are different national maritime interests as well as prioritization. And so therefore, it is very difficult to come up with a so-called monolithic perspectives on regional maritime security. Now, there are a few leading issues, of course, they are considered high-profile problems that were highlighted in the region. First and foremost is definitely the rise of China. It is the elephant in the room, especially when you're talking about Southeast Asia, where I'm situated in. It is very much an issue. It is both for China, the elephant in the room, is both a potential security challenge. It is a threat to some countries in the region, but at the same time, China presents an opportunity for many countries in the region as well. So the other issue to consider is China is a geographical fact, that it is there. You can never change geography. You can change your national interest, but you can never change your geography, right? And it is there. It behooves regional countries who are neighbors to China to try to coexist peacefully with China, because you have to live with your neighbor somehow, right? And for good or bad, it is there with you. So you have to make the best out of it. So this is one particular phenomenon that for Southeast Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific region has been dealing with for quite some time. And going forward, given the intensified great power rivalry that involves China and the US for the most part, as well as the other regional powers, this is going to become and remain a very salient issue. Now, the questions that was posed by the center also asked about the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war and impact on South China Sea and Taiwan. At least based on whatever observations we have and based on the existing prognosis, I think it is perhaps quite adequate to assess that the war itself in Ukraine may not have an immediate impact, for example, on the likelihood of conflict in the South China Sea and to some extent Taiwan, right? Because there were all these commentaries that came about after February 24 that the Ukraine war is going to lead on to China opening up a front on its doorstep against Taiwan, for example. But this likelihood is not deemed to be very high, at least in the short term. But in the medium to long term, it is pretty much very uncertain. I was at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and in one of the closed-door sessions, the Indo-Pacific commander, Admiral Aquilino, was also highlighting about the medium to long-term threat posed by China to Taiwan. Because at least for now, given the Ukraine war and the attention on the war itself, and I think China right now, for all the assumptions that it may have made regarding Taiwan, I think right now the Ukraine war may have forced it to pause and to take stock of the situation and then draw key lessons. And then they go back to the drawing board when it comes to the invasion plan for Taiwan. Then they'll try to revisit and revise those plans. It will take some time. And during this entire process, it's important to pay attention to what happens in the Taiwan Strait as well. So in other words, if anything, even if China is planning or plotting a Taiwan invasion, Ukraine war might have simply put a damper to it. So it's important to note this point. On the South China Sea situation, there is no likelihood of a potential war in the area. For now, China appears to be more preoccupied with doing two things. One is continue to reach out to friends and potential friends in Southeast Asia and try to ensure that they continue to not undermine its interest in the South China Sea, and in that regard, continue to engage in discussions on the South China Sea. Chiefly, of course, the proposed code of conduct in the South China Sea that has been in the works for more than 1 decade. And the other thing that China is doing concurrently is to continue to keep up with its proclivity to exercise maritime coercion to its South China Sea rivals. We are still seeing continued instances of that coercion by Chinese maritime forces, in particular the China Coast Guard, against its Southeast Asian rivals. Vietnam, for example, Malaysia, for example, Indonesia, and the most recent one is the Philippines. And that takes place at the point of time when Southeast Asian countries are still trying to get on with economic recovery during the COVID-19. However, it's important for me to note as a Singaporean and having looked at maritime security in the region that the South China Sea is far from the only problem. And the South China Sea problem is very often not a high priority issue for many Southeast Asian countries because of a whole range of more pressing daily issues such as drug trafficking, smuggling, piracy, and armed robbery against ships. And the South China Sea disputes, while they are important, they are not considered to be of the highest priority. Now, COVID-19 has an impact on regional preparation in maritime security. The focus has been overwhelmingly on economic recovery, trying to grapple with rising debts, trying to grapple with the balance between trying to put more emphasis on defense and security investments and the growing public clamor for healthcare and social security in the wake of COVID-19. And now the Ukraine war brings in additional pressures in the form of inflation and rising prices for goods. And so therefore, when it comes to impact on defense and security investments, it differs from sub-region to sub-region across the Indo-Pacific. And there is right now, at the very least, a growing sentiment towards, increasing regional uncertainty going forward. So generally, countries in the region, and of course, not least of all, Southeast Asia, tends to rely on self-help, and therefore also increasingly on the role that is played by extra-regional powers. They are seen to be potentially counterbalancing China in particular, as well as to create some stability in the region by providing much needed common public goods in the form of military presence, capacity building, for example. Now, allow me to go on to my final section on what I'm going to talk about regarding contributions by the various extra-regional powers in Southeast Asia. And I think the first one will be support for rules-based order, especially for UNCLOS. And in the recent 2 years, we have been seeing a number of extra-regional powers being active in doing that. For example, in the wake of the South China Sea flare-ups in the past 2 years, we saw a number of extra-regional powers submitting the note verbal to the UN, essentially to counter China's expensive claims in the South China Sea. That is in contrary to the 2016 arbitral award on the South China Sea, right? And of course, the other thing that, of course, not many countries will talk about in the region, in Southeast Asia in particular, because in Southeast Asia, those countries are on the front line in the South China Sea issue. So therefore, even though there is not much talked about in terms of the freedom of navigation operations conducted by the US, the general sentiment is that they are at least acquiesced to. They are not necessarily openly welcomed by regional countries because they do not want to run afoul of China and any backlash. But it appears that silence means consent. And US government is encouraged to continue to have its presence in the South China Sea, right? The only downside to it is that regional countries tend to be concerned about the potential risk of conflict between China and the US, given the continued posturing and counter-posturing in the South China Sea by these two powers. In as much that ASEAN countries wanted to sort of assert centrality on the South China Sea issue, the hard truth is that the South China Sea agenda has been largely hijacked by the China-US rivalry more than anything else. And unfortunately, ASEAN has been shunted more to the sidelines or as a sideshow. The other thing that I believe as a Singaporean, which we have been dealing with that for a long time, and it has been something that is a fixture in the region, is at least for Southeast Asia, when it comes to contributions by extra-regional powers, I think capacity building assistance is very much welcome. One thing to note is that the sensitivity towards sovereignty and jurisdictional rights means that regional countries are somewhat against the idea of extra-regional powers conducting maritime patrols in their own waters. And that, of course, includes their EEZ. And so therefore, any capacity building assistance in the form of money, technical assistance, equipment, training, information sharing, and intelligence exchange will be very much appreciated. With that, I end my short brief and I look forward to discussion later. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ko. It's very welcome that we have also this perspective of not only of a regional player, but also of what you called another sub-region. I found it interesting that your semantic approach to what this area that we are covering should be named, and that there are within that we have different sub-regions with different interests. An interesting point that I might take up in the discussion. Now, thank you all for your remarks. We have a huge basket full of arguments and of insights. What I would like to start with, Dr. Rar, and maybe the others might comment on that. You were referring to the European Union strategy on the Indo-Pacific, where you wished to have Germany and other countries be part of. Now, after having heard all of your arguments, particularly also of Dr. Ko's argument, would it be possible from your perspective that we would come up with a comprehensive maritime security strategy in the region, not only from an EU perspective or French or you name it perspective, but where all the others would be included or at least be part of, that we would then not have this distinction, as Dr. Ko mentioned it, the regional countries and the extra regional players. What is your thought about that, sir?
Well, thank you. I mean, first of all, let me say that, you know, this is only a European strategy, but there is definitely no opposition to whatever Colin said just right now. In effect, that's exactly what we mean. The real problem with the strategy is that it's a strategy of the 27, and therefore not everybody has the same interest to implement it the same way, and not the same capacity, and not the same priority. So the main goal, the main difficulty of all this will be not to align our interest, not to align in principle the need for capacity building, technical support, and so on. This is very much part of the strategy as it stands right now. It will be to make sure that it's actually implemented where it should be implemented. A lot of what is being done at the European level is done at based on the decision of each and every state. And what the real difficulty will be to make sure that, you know, everybody will go along. I was saying in my introductory remark that, you know, the strengths of the EU strategy is that it is a strategy and that it does put him in a comprehensive perspective. The weakness of it comes from the very same thing, which is because you've got a set of policies that for which you don't necessarily have equal capacity, the natural tendency will be to pick and choose, and to pick and choose according to your needs of the moment. So this is also very much part of, I would say, the duty of our potential partners in the Indo-Pacific, you know, be it in Southeast Asia, obviously, but also talking about India, I'm talking about a number of African states, by the way, the Eastern Coast, or the island state of the Pacific, to enter a dialogue and make sure that, you know, things are being actually done. And there are clauses for that. For example, the connectivity partnership with India include a clause for cooperation in third country. There is a partnership with Japan about connectivity, which actually has a similar clause, and so on and so forth. So on principle, we fully agree. The question will be now, let's make sure it does work, because this is our common interest. What I do believe also beyond that is that we're seeing sort of an implicit redefinition of Europe's relation with the countries of the Indo-Pacific, which is a much more cooperative approach. Now, everybody has understood that because we have limited capacities, we do have to make sure that the respect of the sovereignty of each actually serve the common goal. So that's a completely different approach than the one which prevailed not so long ago and still prevail to some extent, where the big power from outside will come and provide guarantees. This is still needed, no question. No one is naive enough to believe that we can do without military power, without the US alliance and so on. But this is not sufficient because the actual problem does not necessarily come there. In terms of actual threat, I very much agree with you that there is a lot which is being opened up by the internal situation of each and every state, by their own the deficiencies of their own lack of capacity for that. And we've seen that in the Solomon, by the way. We'll see that elsewhere. We see that being played also in countries like Madagascar, in places like the Comoros and so on. So this is not unique to Southeast Asia. And yes, in principle, we agree on everything. Now, implementation will be key. And that's where we need to put the focus, really.
Thank you, Dr. Grar. A question to Admiral Felt. You were mentioning that with regard to the war in Ukraine, you said that this war is limiting our views on the comprehensive challenges of maritime security, also in this area that we are talking of. And I assume the two other speakers would not disagree with that statement. Now, the second point that you mentioned, which you might give maybe a little more thought on, is you were mentioning that there is a maritime security system in place. So that means something has been built and could be improved or could be built up. So what might, from your perspective, be the approaches that these views are not too much blurred, that all these so-called non-military aspects of maritime security get lost, that we could focus on these issues and challenges that has been mentioned by the three panelists together? Please, Admiral.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think by saying that there is something in place, yes. If you look into the bilateral and trilateral and whatever multilateral treaties between the different regions, and I totally agree that of course there are sub-regions as well, but I was always encouraged by the political and military will of the states in the region of the Straits of Malaga for cooperation. And some years ago, that was unbelievable that would happen, but now it's a question of success. And as far as I know it, from my perspective, and the number of nations which have joined this system and expanded it a little bit is something which gives at least the task of monitoring the region a good perspective. And we all know that nations have their own interests, and somebody do not want to share information with other countries, but this is not specific for the Indo-Pacific situation. This is happening all over the world. So this is something where I think this could be expanded during the years to come. But on the other hand, coming back to your question about the dominating factor of war in Ukraine, what is the effect on other regions? I think the outcome of this war will give a clear signal to countries which are minded like Russia, that they can change borders by force. And this is something which is a real concern. And I think that if you look, and you have asked about the Northern Sea route as well as one of your topics, if you look into the Arctic Ocean, then of course this has already changed, because the Arctic Council has suspended Russia, who has the chair now, and there is nothing, everything has stopped. Even the scientific exchange has stopped. So this is something which is a fact. And now the question is how to carry on. The next chair would be Norway, but it will be in a year to come. So this is something which must be, can we do things without Russia in this part of the world? And can we achieve cooperation and exchange of information in the Indo-Pacific without asking China if they like it? And I understand very well during my visits to South Korea that the situation there is different, and the people think that they have to take care of China as a big elephant in the room and closely to them. But the question is, do we, to what degree are we dependent on what China is allowing us to do? But on the other hand, this is something which the countries in the region have to answer, and they have to find a way for cooperation, but they have to be aware as well. And I do not think that looking for the military, the naval or the air force or the army, is a solution for that. But on the other hand, I think all countries must be prepared from the military perspective as well. And my last point is, I'm a little bit surprised that climate change has not been mentioned so far. I think that climate change will be not now and not tomorrow, but in the medium term and in the long term, it will cause a lot of changes, even for China and for Russia, and they are ignoring that to a high degree, not totally, but to a high degree. And I think if Europe is going for this in a more appropriate way and doing this together with countries around the Indo-Pacific, that would be a way for the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Felt. Over to Dr. Cole. Already Dr. Grar mentioned Shangri-La. You have apparently been attending the sessions that took place a couple of weeks back, to sort of going towards the end of our roundtable, and we have heard of a lot of challenges, of problems. Did you get out of what has been discussed, what have been presented, that there are processes and ideas on strategies in place or offered that would really enhance maritime security in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific? What is your idea on, what was your impression on that at Shangri-La?
Thank you so much, sir. During the Shangri-La dialogue, I believe those of you who attended might have agreed with me, is that it is quite special this time around. Not just because it's the first Shangri-La dialogue after COVID-19 that is held in person, but also because the focus is somewhat quite overwhelmingly on Ukraine because of what happened. And certainly there is a much discussion about what happens to Ukraine and how that would imply when it comes to Taiwan Strait security going forward. And China has always been the elephant in the room. At least one of these simultaneous plenary discussions or sessions that we had in the evening on the first day of the Shangri-La dialogue, which touched on maritime security. I attended that because I look at maritime security, but the discussion did not actually yield any conclusion regarding the new maritime security framework going forward. I believe it has been down to a few potential factors. Over these years when Shangri-La dialogue is being conducted, prior to Ukraine coming into the limelight, much of the emphasis has very much been on the South China Sea. And there's a lot of discussions on the South China Sea over the years. And I think somehow it reached a certain point of stasis when it comes to thinking about how best to go forward. We know there is a 2016 arbitral award to be upheld, and there is always China that is doing what it's doing, and there is always, continued demand for extra-regional involvement in the South China Sea, and there is this tussle between these competing priorities. But the problem has always been that nobody really seriously talked about a maritime security approach on that, for one very simple reason, largely because the Indo-Pacific, and not just even the broader Indo-Pacific, even in Southeast Asia, it is very difficult to come up with a consensus on whether any particular maritime security problem requires focus or emphasis. To have a framework, it requires countries to come together to think about it and come to a consensus. We have existing architecture in Southeast Asia that applies to the broader Indo-Pacific, or more broadly, the Western Pacific, right? In South Asia, there is, of course, the Indian Ocean Rim Association that looks at maritime safety. Over in the Western Pacific, there is ASEAN-centered institutions such as, for example, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Plus meeting. There is also the, what they call the expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum. There are many of these institutions in place. I think there is a general recognition that there is no need to actually reinvent the wheel. I think more importantly is to build on this existing architecture and try to see how best to go about dealing with common security challenges. The unfortunate thing is that very often we are stuck with dialogue at this level because we have too many actors in the region. They come with their own agenda, they come with their own particular concerns on maritime security. Very much, it has been more of a dialogue that shares those competing perspectives, and then it goes down to what we call the lowest common denominator of maritime security cooperation, such as, for example, counterterrorism, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief. But nobody really wants to talk about the South China Sea. Nobody really wants to talk about China as a threat to Taiwan, for example, and we are stuck, basically. So we are actually down to these, multilateral dialogue within ASEAN or at the ASEAN level. And then we have largely what we call bilateral collaboration that deals with more in-depth, more complex maritime security problems, and that largely revolve around a few things. One is the US hub and spoke alliances and partnership system. And of course, the existing ASEAN maritime security cooperative arrangements, such as they are considered bilateral, not so much multilateral, like the Malacca Straits Patrol and the Sulu Sea trilateral cooperative arrangements. And other than that, we are seeing the Quad, we're seeing AUKUS, and then we are seeing also the explosion of new initiatives that are minilateral in nature that brings together like-minded parties to deal with particular issues. And that's why we saw, for example, France, India, and the US engaging in exercises and whatnot. So I think going forward, we have no concerted single approach on maritime security. I think what we're seeing here is a hodgepodge of different approaches that are conducted at the bilateral, unilateral, and multilateral level, and they are overlapping and they have, I would say, duplicating links in that process. I think going forward, that is going to be the state of affairs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very comprehensive, but not very positive note. But still, many are working, but there is no coherence in that effort, which nobody most probably thought that this would show up in the first Shangri-La dialogue after this long break. Now, gentlemen, checking my clock and watch, we are gradually coming to an end. So I would invite you in the same order to maybe give a comment on what you have heard, or maybe to bring in a final message so that we then could conclude our roundtable. Can I invite Dr. Graar for his final remarks?
look over optimistic, and I certainly not are. I'm over optimistic, but I haven't heard any real contradiction between what we said. I certainly recognize the lack of coherence of the approach. I also tend to believe that what we are seeing today, which is the crisis in Ukraine, also gives an indication as to what we should do, because this is more or less what we have done. A show of unity goes a long way. I mean, there are always questions as to how long this is going to stay, if our interests will still converge and so on, but this is definitely something which has had an impact on the war. The Indo-Pacific is a construct which is in a way similar. There are a number of things that we haven't talked about during this hour, like what's happening with the small island states in the Pacific, the Solomon and so on, because this is also indicative of what the real problems are. I think we agree on the direction, we agree on the diagnostic. We don't yet coordinate sufficiently, and I will take that point, and I agree with that. But yet, we're far away from where we were only a year ago, and yes, the only thing that I would ask our friend from the Indo-Pacific to do is don't despair completely on us, and keep talking to us and keep pushing for things to go in the direction that you want. I think that to a large extent it would serve our own interests as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grar. Admiral Felt, your final comment, please.
Yes, I would only draw your attention on the fact that 2020, the German government issued government policy guidelines for the Indo-Pacific region. That was the first time that our government was really taking care of this very important region. And it was, of course, late, hopefully not too late. But one outcome of this guideline was, as you mentioned before, General Gerber, the way the German frigate Bayer did through the Indo-Pacific. And due to the fact that we are very limited in capabilities, this will possibly happen again in 2 years' time. But in the year in between, the Air Force, German Air Force will take the lead, and maybe together with the Navy, they will create some some visits and establishing new connectivities and new relations to the states in this region again from a military perspective. But the policy guidelines are only, they are very comprehensive. They are dealing with all aspects which has been mentioned today, and the military is only one of it. But it's, of course, it's very close to my former business. So I think it is important. And I would really say, if the European Union can create a force to visit, to do what we are calling naval diplomacy in the region, with a lot of other things which we can do. And France, for example, with the regional knowledge from a European point of view, could take the lead for that. And then by invitation of the countries, I think all European countries would really appreciate to pay these visits. And we can do that. And this is something which is in one point of maritime security issues. It's a military task, but it's reaching far beyond the military. And as we all know, by naval diplomacy, we are always invited all parts of the societies of our country which we are visiting. So it's not a purely military issue, but we can use this as something which can increase a little bit the feeling that we are taking care if it is wanted. But this is very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Admiral Felt. It's interesting that only almost at the end of our discussion, the word diplomacy came up for the first time. And I think as we have diplomats here on our panel, I think they will have to take a large share of that to mitigate and to bring things together where all then the other actors can bring in, but I think there is a lot to do also on the diplomatic side, and not only in heavy metal or huge ships. With that, I hand over to the final comments of Dr. Koh, please.
Thank you so much. And I trust that I am standing in between all of you and the end of the session, so I'll make it very quick. And not to belabor upon the very good points that were raised by my fellow panelists, I wanted to maybe share a little bit more regarding what I see as the way going forward in the region when it comes to maritime security. Some of the points that I raised earlier, I will emphasize it a little bit. Is to first take into account that the Indo-Pacific is a very complex region that has sub-regional nuances to consider. And so when we deal with maritime security, very often we have to deal with it from that approach, meaning that, you know, if there is the intention to approach the Indo-Pacific with a one-size-fits-all framework, very often it may fall flat in its face. You will face resistance, you'll face the sort of questions that were raised by various countries around. And so very often, even though it takes a bit more hard work to try to, you know, reach out to these countries to promote maritime security, it is a very fruitful enterprise to do that by reaching out individually and try to take into account these sub-regional nuances. So I think that is one to think about. Second is, when it comes to diplomacy that was raised by the earlier panelists, I thought that was interesting because it does, you know, behoove upon me to talk about two aspects of maritime cooperation. One is what we call practical security cooperation. We deal with that all the time. We talk about search and rescue operations. We talk about, you know, counter-piracy operations and whatnot. But in this region, I think what is lacking here is the emphasis on confidence and security building measures. I think this is something that has been rather put aside, largely because the lack of trust may have mitigated against it. But it is precisely because of the lack of trust that we need these mechanisms. So which is something that I thought, you know, regional countries and those outside the region could put more emphasis in trying to highlight the need for these mechanisms, and thereby, you know, hopefully, you know, we could have a sort of a framework of sort in place for the entire region. So with that, I end my final remarks, and thank you so much again for inviting me to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koh. You basically have summarized some of the major findings of this session. I think we did not start our roundtable with having the objective of finding a solution for the future. But the only thing that I would like here to mention, that was your last point, because I worked for a long time in confidence and security building measures operations. And I think with my own experience in the Indo-Pacific, there we have a lot of room for improvement. And as CAPS, I think that might be a topic that we would pick up in the near future, where we should address these issues, where there is a lot of experience, particularly in Europe, as there is some tradition which has been lost now with the war, to some extent with the war in Ukraine, but there is knowledge and expertise and capability available. And I think that would be a topic to sort of continue our discussion. With that, Dr. Grar, Admiral Felt, Dr. Koh, I would like to thank you very much on behalf of CAPS for this very interesting, thought-provoking roundtable, and I think it was worthwhile doing so. I wish you all the best and hope to see you back in another format in some time. Thank you very much. With that, the roundtable is concluded. Thank you.